Hello. So I'll start this by talking about Dune. Went to see Dune last Friday. I went with my brother to see the first part Thursday night and then the second part at midnight, the first screening. And the first one, went to see it with my family. When I left the theater, I was disappointed. I did not like it. I did not like it because the film didn't follow the classical structure, which isn't a sin in and of itself, but it didn't offer conflict and true characterization and character building. What I mean by that is that the protagonist was an empty shell, and every character was an empty shell. There was no sense of conflict. It's based on a book. The book is super dense, so they have to pick the scenes they want to give you an idea of where the plot is going. But they didn't do a great job at creating characters. And I always go back to this moment. I think Martin Scorsese talks about it in an interview. The thing that brings him back to certain movies is the characters. That's why he goes back to watch them. The characters. That's the most important thing. And then you have David Mamet, who grabs a screenplay and shakes it and says, can you see any plot falling out? Can you see any structure? Blah, blah, blah. It's all characters. And the point is that at the top, in my opinion, the best screenwriters, they are able to convey everything through the characters. The dialogue tells you what the plot is and what the story is, blah, blah, blah. And on one end, you have people like David Mamet, who are really good at doing that, at moving the plot along through the characters without anything feeling wasted because he's so focused on conflict. But then you have people like Paul Thomas Anderson, who's able to do that to a degree in specific films. For example, not especially in The Master or in Licorice Pizza. Well, yeah, in Licorice Pizza. But he's able to flesh out three-dimensional characters, which to me is the most interesting thing that can be done in a movie. Daniel Plainview feels like a three-dimensional character, like a real character. I watch the film because I want to see him in action. Dune, I'm not going to watch Dune because I want to see Paul Atreides in action. And yet, after I felt so disappointed, because there wasn't this narrative, this dynamic narrative moving forward, making me care for the characters, there was none of that. I still wanted to see it again. I wanted to see it again because Denis Villeneuve decided to kind of attack the audience from a different angle. Instead of giving us a pristine plot that kept us engaged, is he going to succeed? Who is he? All of these classical things. He decided to focus almost exclusively on aesthetic. The story he's telling through Dune is a story we've seen and heard and watched before, countless times. Every story is the same. Dune specifically was influenced by other famous stories, by history, and in turn it influenced the most enormous franchises in the world, such as Star Wars. So when you come in, I think it was written, I don't know actually, in the 60s maybe, Dune? When you come in my God, I'm tired. 60 years later, yeah. When you come in 60 years later, and mainstream popular culture has been devouring the crumbs of Dune to a degree, and we've seen every single aspect, all the twists, all the ideas, we've seen them in a different shape through other media, through other stories, through other franchises. It's difficult to then come in and say, hey, this was the original thing. Let's, experience it as if it's brand new. You can't. It's all been done before. And so what he tried to do is really to focus on the aesthetic of the world and the experience of watching the movie, creating something that's truly grandiose and that truly you can lose yourself inside of. And that's the only reason I went back to see Dune, the first one, and I ended up liking it. And a lot of my favorite movies, every time I watch them the first time, I am disappointed. The first time I saw Drive, which I consider my favorite movie of all time because it's the movie that made me think that movies can be more than what I have seen before. That you can truly be free in that medium as an artist to create something that's... Is it still recording? Yeah. To create something almost transcendental. And what I mean by that is, the film Drive had been recommended to me for years. I think, so I was 16 when I first saw it, 16 or 17. And I had heard about the film many times. It's about a getaway driver, action movie, is what I was told. And I could visualize the film based on the few images that I had seen, which was mostly the poster, and based on what I had been told. I've seen that movie before. It's a getaway driver, it's an action film. It's probably going to be some cool chase scenes in cars, blah, blah, blah. But since specifically my father was recommending me that movie, saying it's so good, I thought it must be the best version of that genre possible. It's the classical film I've seen before, but somehow it's better than the rest. And then I saw it, and it left me cold, because it was extremely disappointing. It didn't do everything these other movies do, but better. It went a totally different direction. And the thing that stayed with me the most was the aesthetic. The music, cinematography, the visuals. The film is truly a good example of how the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. Where the script is pretty light. There's no great dialogue really. There's some memorable lines, but the dialogue is nothing special. But when everything comes together, it's perfect, I would say. And so that's the film that made me think you can construct a movie where you don't have to follow the established, the rules. You don't have to make a plot that, features a happy ending and a guy falling in love and a hero, and have this... Even the first scene, right, the chase scene, the camera never leaves the vehicles or the vehicle. They never film from the outside, so it doesn't glorify the scene, the moment of the car scene. It completely takes a different approach where the emphasis is on the people, specifically the driver, in the scene. Your face is a broadcasting screen, I heard somewhere. The face is extremely powerful. We experience the chase through his eyes and through looking at him. And so clearly the director wanted us to experience the scene through him, and he found a way that seems counterintuitive, because you've seen so many car chase scenes in your life. You want to see the actual car from the outside. You want to see how it moves. If it's Fast and Furious, you've got the most expensive cars, you want to see it. And the director, on purpose, takes that away from you. I think Alfred Hitchcock also has a quote on that, on the idea of filming vehicles from the outside and how he doesn't like it. So that film was a revelation, Drive, because as far as plot is concerned, I was disappointed. I didn't get the big set pieces in the way I wanted them to happen, even though later on there's a chase scene that's filmed more conventionally. I didn't get any of the things that I expected. Once again, I expected the same movie as I've seen a million times before, but done better, and I got something totally different. So that's the movie that made me say, okay, I know what I want to do now. I want to make movies. I was 16, so it was 8 years ago, and that's when I decided to go on this path I'm currently on. And Dune exhibits the same, the same kind of aesthetic properties. As I said, Dune is telling a story we've heard a million times before, the chosen one, even though Dune specifically is about this idea that the chosen one... I think a lot of people say the chosen one isn't the chosen one for Dune, but from what I've read, it's more about how the chosen one might lead people into horrific situations, and that doesn't necessarily make them, not be the chosen one. The idea that he gets prescience, and so he's able to access information outside of time, gives me this impression that he understands what must be done, even though it's awful. And so it's not really a question of he's not the chosen one, it's that we reject the idea of the perfect chosen one super being, and instead we embrace the idea that in order to go through history as a species, to survive and to keep growing, we have to do horrific things and people have to die, that type of stuff. Regardless, the story has been told before. And so what Villeneuve did is that instead of trying to do it better, he took a completely different angle and tried to really focus almost exclusively on aesthetic. And I was telling myself, Denis Villeneuve is not really good at crafting three-dimensional characters after seeing that movie, because that movie fails on every level throughout, the first and the second, at crafting people that we would want to return to the cinema to see. Then I question, is that true? I think of Enemy. I have seen this. He made a movie in black and white in Quebec. People think that his first movie is Enemy. It is not. And there's another one, Maelstrom. It's hard to pronounce, Maelstrom. I started it, but I didn't really like it. I should finish it. But so Enemy is mostly focused on plot. Then you have Enemy. Is it Sicario after? No, Prisoners. Prisoners might be his best because of how tight the plot is. The characterization is really good. The acting obviously is perfect. Then you have Roger Deakins, flawless cinematography. Prisoners. Then you have Sicario. Great script once again. Not focused on characterization to the degree that, for example, Paul Thomas Anderson is. But it's so well written that naturally the plot and everything is driven by the characters. So this is a really good one. And then you have Blade Runner 2049, which also deals with the idea of being a false messiah. This time, literally. The tragic figure of Officer K, who thinks he's the chosen one, only to learn that he's just another pawn that was needed essentially to get the chosen one where they were supposed to be. So I think it's more the case that Denis, either he felt like the way to tell Dune in 2020, whenever it came out, was to not follow the classical, once again, mainstream blockbuster character arc and storytelling style of a character who goes through all these difficulties and grows and learns something at the end. He didn't want to do that. And so he thought the best way to do Dune, once again, a story where every single element of the story has been explored before in other movies and stories since the book was released. The way was to actually focus on really doing what all of these other ones haven't done and build a three-dimensional world and an aesthetic, a really memorable aesthetic. He talks a lot about dreams, the power of dreams and the importance of dreams. And I never thought about him in those terms before seeing Dune. He deals with it more, the kind of poetic, metaphorical aspects of life. He deals with that more in Arrival. But it's a film that left me quite cold. Once again, the characters, you don't watch Arrival for the characters, for Amy Adams' character. She's quite cold and feels quite empty, and the whole story of her daughter, I never felt any kind of true sympathy for her. The plot is where it's at. But with Dune, he really goes into that kind of Lynch territory of trying to create something visceral, trying to make us feel something through the images and the sound, which is fascinating because once again, this film, Dune, sits up there with things like Game of Thrones, with Star Wars, and I'm sure a million of other things. And these things are very much on the surface in terms of they're telling a story, the actors are going to tell you the story, the set pieces, the CGI, etc. And Denis tries to make it more of a truly kind of, people can talk about cinema as a religious experience in regards to how the story we tell are the same stories we've been telling since the beginning of time. The superheroes are just the new versions of gods, etc. And Denis is trying to tap into that transcendental aspect of cinema that no high-profile director does. You think about how, for example, Christopher Nolan does it when he's able to delve into the subconscious, and it's also literal. It doesn't feel like a dream. It feels like maybe... Didn't I put myself into airplane mode? It feels like a weird, logical version of a dream, but it doesn't feel like a dream. And then you have Oppenheimer, and he tries to put us in the shoes of Oppenheimer being humiliated, puts him naked in a room. How on the nose. Not really interesting. But with Dune, Denis really tries to get into that more spiritual aspect of characters. And so the second one suffers from the same problems as the first in my initial reaction. You don't care for the characters, not truly. The plot, there is not enough struggle and conflict to keep you, interested in the plot truly. What keeps you interested is the aesthetic. But I suppose the point of the whole thing is that Atreides, Paul, gains omniscience, I believe it's called, or prescience. So he becomes a man god, essentially. And from that point on, he's able to defeat his enemies kind of effortlessly. Because you think about the last scene, the big fight where the worms attack the Sardaukar, I think they're called, the warriors. There's no fight, really. There's no conflict. They just come and they wipe them out. That's not how you do a blockbuster movie. We've all seen Marvel movies, superhero movies. That last scene is crucial, and you have to sell the audience on the idea that the hero might lose. Now, he does that in the hand-to-hand combat, or the knife scene between Paul Atreides and the bald bad guy, the skinny, short, bald bad guy. He does that there. He sells you on this idea that this is the final fight and blah, blah, blah. But seeing it felt truly disappointing. And although with distance now, in hindsight, I do get where Denis Villeneuve was trying to go with the story. The idea that, once again, they just wipe out the big army at the end effortlessly, and that they are unstoppable from that point. I get that. It doesn't feel good when you are used to watching movies, when you've seen Marvel movies, etc. It doesn't feel good to have the heroes just wipe out the villains at the end, when that's the thing you've been waiting for the whole story. But the thing is, he never really sells us on the idea that the villains were anything special to begin with. The story begins and they are wiping out the Harkonnens in the desert quite easily. Once again, you can go back to the idea that he's a chosen one. The whole point is he's not really human, but that happens in the middle of the movie. That's when he gains omniscience. So I do think that is a true flaw of the movie, is that when the movie begins, that's the moment where he should have sold us on the idea that there is a threat, that the Harkonnens are dangerous, that the Fremen are struggling. And he doesn't do that. That whole power struggle is not done correctly, in my opinion. Because then you have the Harkonnens destroying one of the Fremen's homes. And you think, why didn't they do that? Why didn't they do that earlier? So you have the Fremens beating them easily in the desert. And you think, why are they struggling? They could just wipe out all of the Harkonnens. There's not much struggle here. And then on the other side, you have the Harkonnens coming and destroying the Fremen's home. And you think, why are they not doing that? Why were they not doing that earlier? Why is there a fight happening? Why is there a war when one side seems to be powerless? And it keeps shifting and you wonder, that doesn't add up. So I'm going to go see it again, because I think, once again, aesthetically, as something that's trying to be, to hit you in parts where you're not used to being attacked in the cinema, especially for something of that scale, I think it's truly successful. The aesthetic is exceptional. So Dune 2, I can't really give a kind of a grade or anything like that. I'm still ambivalent, but some things it does truly spectacularly well. Also, the music. The main thing, the woman kind of screaming almost, I don't like it. It feels cheap. It feels really cheap. It feels like a parody, you know. The idea, I heard Denis say that the idea was that this was the voice of the desert, right? And throughout, there are so many interesting sounds. The Baron, what's his name? The big guy. The sounds that his spine thing make is one of the best sound effects I've ever heard. It's so good. And even the sounds of, it sounds like pipes against a heater. Brrr, great. But the lady singing, if that's supposed to embody the desert's voice, that's too literal. That feels too human. That's a lady just shouting. You know, it's too, to me, it's too obvious, and it's not ethereal enough. I don't think the human voice can reach a level of etherealness, you know, powerful enough to really embody this idea of the ultimate deity that is the desert. Because the desert, as they like to say when they review Dune, is a character of its own, right? The desert, but it is. It is very much this truly all-powerful character in the story. And to have, once again, this scream of a woman, to me, that felt wrong. I would have preferred something like the Sardaukar when they speak, or the sounds we have at the very start of the movie with this quote that surprises you, right? It doesn't sound human. It sounds like something else, right? And that works really well. But the lady screaming, nah. They should have gone to another layer of trying to create a sound that feels more distant and less human, I think. What was I going to say? So, yeah, Dune, I can't give it a grade. But the same way I can't give Drive a grade, for example, or Gummo, one of my favorite movies, or The Master. These are films that I cherish and I consider my favorite of all time. Specifically because the first time I saw them, I didn't like them, but something compelled me to go back and see them again. There was something about them. They all break rules. Once again, Dune breaks rules, and it made me uncomfortable. And yet I have to go back and see it again because it's an experience that's truly unique. So I can recommend the film, but I can't give it a grade, which is maybe somewhat contradictory. And I can't stress enough how frustrated I was that Dune and that Villeneuve broke the rules of screenwriting in a way. I know it sounds strange. 2016, I decided I want to make movies, and I started writing, you know, trying to make a screenplay. Today, I still haven't finished a single screenplay, and I've done, you know, the most I could to learn about how to write a screenplay, how it works, you know, things like the 3-act structure and how to really structure the movie, how to break it down into sequences, etc. I believe, you know, I have to first finish a screenplay in the most formulaic way, the most classical way, and there's nothing wrong with that. A lot of great movies are made that way. I need to do that first before I can venture into Paul Thomas Anderson territory, Christopher Nolan, Tarantino, where, you know, you have the expertise to truly experiment with the structure. And so seeing a movie that breaks all those rules, there's something frustrating about it when I think to myself, here I am trying to structure this as tightly as possible, my own screenplay, trying to make sure that there is conflict, that the engine of the movie never stops, that it keeps moving, that there's energy, that there's, you know, each conflict leads to the next conflict. You know, trying my best to create 3-dimensional characters that people will not necessarily like, but that feel real. And then we have this guy with a huge budget breaking all the rules. There's something frustrating about that. And I suppose it shouldn't cloud my judgment in terms of how good the film was in the end. But it's strange to see that film being embraced so quickly by critics, because critics don't like, well, it depends, but it's not really true. I do get the impression that critics don't like it too much when you break the rules, but that's not true because they love those shitty art house movies where nothing happens. I mean, even the word critics, is that an oxymoron? I've heard this word before. I would love to use it in a sentence, like I'm a smart adult, or the internet is off. The word critics doesn't make sense, right? Because these are just people with different opinions. But still, I'm surprised that the film gained such a high rating. You know, after seeing it, my expectation was, cardboard cutouts characters, you don't really care for them, blah, blah, blah. The stuff you usually hear for most blockbuster movies, where there's no characterization. You know, pick any of the Fast and Furious movies. Also, it's interesting, Villeneuve and, what's his name, Christopher Nolan, are considered some of the greatest directors working today. I think they're overrated when it comes to being directors. And something people don't seem to realize is that a director, as weird as that sounds, doesn't do that much on the movie, for the movie. It sounds weird, but when you look at the credits at the end of the movie and you look at how many people are involved, sure, the director has final say, and then you have cases where you have a writer-director, for example, more influence. But when you say Christopher Nolan has such a great visual style and you say things like that, what you don't realize is that there are people, there's a whole team dedicated to the visual style of the movie. And sure, some directors are more knowledgeable on the visual style than others. But I think it's Tarantino who talks about this, the idea that as a director, you have to be able to formulate your vision, right? And let other people bring it to life. People who are experts in that field. Because once again, the image, when you think that Christopher Nolan has a great visual style, there's a whole team behind the image. There's a whole team behind just the lighting of the image. There's a whole team behind the camera, parts of the camera. There's so many people involved, and the cinematographer is the person usually with the best visual, the most visual knowledge. And to me, that's evident when I see Denis Villeneuve's work, because Dune 2 and Dune 1, visually, they are spectacular when it comes to bringing, once again, this world to life, making it feel real. The sound plays a huge part in that too. But Mr. Fraser is nothing compared to, what's his name? I don't remember his name, Fraser. I was going to say Brendan Fraser, but I'm pretty sure that's the guy who plays the whale. The cinematographer is really good at aesthetic. You know, aesthetic is a word that can apply to anything, to clothes, to images, to sound. He's really good at aesthetic. But when it comes to cinema, Roger Deakins is the best. What I mean by that is accuracy, is details. An image crafted by Roger Deakins, you know, you can immediately tell it's perfect. And what I mean by perfect is I really mean every element in the image is where it should be. Everything is just arranged in such a way that the image is, you know, readable the way it should be. Once again, some films are supposed to be more chaotic, some films less so. He's always on point. He always knows how to bring the vision to life. And then you see, so Denis Villeneuve, who does Blade Runner 2049, and then he does Dune. They're both spectacular in terms of world building. They both look beautiful. But when it comes to accuracy and just the camera always moving in a perfect way and being in the right place, etc., I think that Fraser is not as good as Roger Deakins. And I think that tells you that as good as Villeneuve is with visuals, the visuals are only as good as he plus his cinematographer is. And so what I'm trying to say is that Deakins is amazing at visuals. A great director picks a good collaborator. But the visuals of Dune are not as good as they would have been if Roger Deakins was involved. They are great when it comes to special effects, all that stuff. But when it comes to really moving the camera in the perfect way, placing the camera in the right place, I think it's in the first one, there's a scene that's so disgustingly edited, where it cuts really quickly and it's jarring and it's ugly. And I thought, how does that happen? I've never seen that on a Roger Deakins project. Why? Because the way he shoots, the way he places the actors, etc., is so meticulous. There's no room for error. So the things I want to get at specifically, for example, are blocking. When you talk about Denis Villeneuve, who's admittedly better than Christopher Nolan, they are not great at blocking. And nowadays, no one is. Blocking used to be just part of cinema in the previous century, many decades ago. It is not today. Today, the greatest filmmakers don't care about blocking. Tarantino is someone who cares about blocking because he's so inspired by classical directors. But most filmmakers, and even the best, like Christopher Nolan, don't put that much importance on really planning the scene out like having a choreography. You look at the Dark Knight movies. The fight scenes are just horrible. They're ugly. They're not dynamic. It doesn't really feel like a fight. It doesn't look cinematic even. It's terrible because he doesn't have this. It seems he doesn't have this way of thinking that involves placing people in a 3D, on a set or regardless if it's a set or not. We'll call it a set. He doesn't think about placing people in a set and how the camera will interact with them intricately, in an intricate fashion. It just doesn't pop in his mind, and it doesn't pop in most filmmakers' minds today. And that's why the camera is always moving. That's why you'll have a scene of 10 characters talking at a table, and the scene opens with the camera sliding slowly, not revealing anything. Sometimes people's heads are hiding other people's heads. Nothing's happening, but the director has to move the camera for some reason. So it's really sloppy. I thought about this more recently because of Movie Wise on YouTube, highly recommend, who talks about this, about how blocking is an art. It's an art that's specific to cinema. You have to do blocking in theater, but there's no camera movement. So you're mostly blocking in a way that the image that you're creating is readable from any angle. In cinema, there's only one angle, and so when you move the camera, the beauty is you know exactly where people are gonna be in that picture that you're painting. If people move, they can reveal things, etc., and that's completely absent from modern filmmaking. But someone like Spielberg, you have Spielberg and Martin Scorsese, who are the older directors who learns, in a different fashion than modern filmmakers, and who stick to visual literacy. Scorsese talks about that a lot. Visual literacy, I believe, yes. And the idea that cinema is a medium where there are things that only exist in cinema. If you pay no mind to blocking, editing is something that most of these filmmakers do well because they have a great editor. But if you pay no mind to blocking, that's one of the things that only exists in cinema. And that's one of the things that's extremely important, even when you don't notice it. No one is going to go see Dune or Oppenheimer and say, oh, the blocking wasn't really that good, because it doesn't exist anymore. It's not really something that people notice or think about, critics included. Where was I? Yeah. I wanted to break down films and filmmakers in 3 categories in those terms that I just mentioned: plot, character, and I suppose the third one was maybe aesthetic. Yeah. So someone like Tarantino, when his last movie, Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, as he stated himself, is exclusively about character. You don't watch Once Upon a Time in Hollywood for the plot, right? Nolan makes movies that are exclusively about plot. You don't watch any of his movies for the characters, except maybe Oppenheimer, because it's a real character. But you see Tenet, that was the pinnacle of him going all the way into, I make movies about plot, about ideas. The characters are not what I make my movies about. You're not going to watch Tenet because of the protagonist. And even something like Memento, which is more intimate in a way, you don't watch that movie because of the main character. The main character is always talking about the plot. And then you have something like Dune or like Drive, which is more about aesthetic. And I suppose a movie can be great if it does all three well, or if it does one or two of them really well. When I make movies, I would like to do all three well, but that's a rare thing. So something like Parasite, a movie I'm obsessed with, is, number one is plot, for sure. The structure of the movie is exceptional. It's great. Then number two is aesthetic. It's really well shot. And then number three, you will have characters. You don't watch the film because of the characters. Dune, you don't watch because of the characters or the plot. You watch it because of the aesthetic. And I suppose the plot comes second and the characters third. And that's, one of the things I don't like about it is that those number two and number three are so far from number one. The aesthetic is so great when the characters are so uninteresting, and the plot is so... the plot is second. The plot is not great. What I mean by that is the way the plot is told is not great. There's not much conflict, etc. Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, aesthetic is really good, but number one is definitely the characters, the way they speak, the way they interact, the way they move. That's number one. Then the plot is still pretty interesting. You want to see what's going to happen at the end, even though... Well, especially the first time you see it. You've seen Inglourious Basterds. You know about the Manson murders, so you think, what is he going to do this time? So the plot is there. And the aesthetic is really good as well. Shot on anamorphic, recreated that 1968, was it, or 69, time period. Really good. And then you have people like Paul Thomas Anderson, who, he's a master at aesthetic, great at it. Master of characterization, great at it. But then plot-wise, he's not that interested. Drive, my favorite movie of all time, maybe, top three. Mostly about aesthetic. The characters are there. There's minimal characterization. Minimal? It's not minimal. I mean, it's on purpose, obviously, but you do watch the film in part because of the protagonist. And then plot, it's the most basic plot of all time, and it's done well. But I suppose the conclusion to that idea here is that I personally don't like the idea of just picking one in the way Christopher Nolan does. Not necessarily picking one, but disregarding one is something I don't love. And something in a movie like Dunkirk, which is a masterclass in filmmaking and screenwriting, number one, I suppose, is the plot. Number two would be the aesthetic. And then characters, non-existent. And I mean, this whole idea of character versus plot is complicated. David Mamet doesn't believe that it's a thing. And what I mean by character is, as I mentioned before, is creating someone that feels three-dimensional. Make your character struggle, and then the audience will like them and identify with them. That's true, but that's too easy. Making the character struggle, as he does in Dunkirk, is effective in bringing us into the movie, in absorbing us in the story. But doing what Paul Thomas Anderson does, of doing that and then some more, of making someone feel like they exist, of making us feel like these characters exist whilst we're watching the movie, that's a true skill, and these two are not mutually exclusive. But these are absolutely complicated, dreams I have of being able to truly marry all three and not disregard any. Another point or another idea that Dune explores is the danger of charismatic leaders. And it's funny, I was thinking about that recently, the idea that truth isn't, when it comes to the advancement and the evolution of human civilization, if you think in terms of evolution and how we came to be what we are now, the idea that survival of the fittest, the aspects of what we were that made us less well suited to survival were incrementally erased because those persons that exhibited those characteristics were killed. And so only the strong survive until today, where the smartest, people are left. The parts of the kind of the species that were strongest remain, right? So in that regard, truth is important because we are here now because of truth. We didn't say, oh, this guy is stronger, therefore he's going to survive. No, nature selected based on what was, not on what people thought was, not on what anything like that. Nature selected the fittest, and the weakest got wiped away. I think that's the idea of, is it evolution? Who cares? We've all heard that before. We were things in the sea, and then we came out on land, etc., evolved. Here we are today. But there's a new aspect that comes into play when we gain consciousness, or even before that charismatic leaders are able to bypass the power of truth. Charismatic leaders and strength is able to overpower truth. If someone is strong and is able to make people follow him, regardless of if the earth is flat or round, if these people are good or bad, history will be written according to their words. And I thought that was interesting, an interesting aspect to the story, exploring how the thing that dictates where humanity goes today, in part, is charisma, is the power of having people listen to you, of being persuasive. The reason I started doing this here, in part, the idea of practicing speaking, this power, the power of the voice in Dune, the power of the voice in reality, is able to completely kind of cast a huge shadow on the truth and lead people in any direction it wants to. And so Dune explores that, truly interesting. And when you think about the world you live in today, what information you have access to, what information is being thrown at you consistently for you to believe a certain thing, and you think about how that's mirrored in the idea of Paul Atreides. How you can, if you can convince people that these people are bad, then as far as the world is concerned, they are. Some more. Something I talked to my brother about. We are both what you might consider introverts, and as introverts will know, one annoying part of this, of not being as well calibrated in social situations, is that you often feel unheard. And so when I talk with my brother, it's truly fascinating. I was talking to him, a few days ago, but we had that conversation. We talked for an hour or two. And I was looking at him and I was thinking, one, we are so aligned in the way we think and in the way we experience the world, because we're so similar, that in a way it's like I'm talking to myself. Because the thing he's talking to me about, the complaint he has, the observation he has, is one I have had before. So I thought about how sometimes I talk to myself about these questions. I ask myself, I try to think of a solution, of a reason. And then here the same thing was happening, but with him. He's a different person. And It's partly because of the script I'm writing, and it relates to that. The idea that, is he a different person? Or is it just the same thing as me discussing that question with myself? Obviously, the fact that he's a fully fledged human being with his own experiences means he's going to bring other things to the table. But we were in agreement with the conclusions we drew. And one thing I said to him, which I hadn't occurred to me before, was that we tend to, as people who are more closed off, who spend more time by themselves, and who are not as well socially calibrated, we are so used to talking to ourselves that even in a social context, we tend not to talk to others. What I mean by that is the classical example of you make a joke and no one hears it, and 5 minutes later someone who's louder makes the same joke and everyone reacts. There's multiple parameters to that. Often the person who's extroverted, you think you're in a party scene, for example, you have that person who's extroverted, they tend to speak louder. A lot of people do this thing of laughing at their own joke, and that can be contagious in a way. It's a weird signal of, hey, I made a joke and it's funny, laugh. But that works for some reason. And once again, us who are introverted, we don't understand that truly because it's not something we would do. The idea of bringing attention to ourselves specifically, even if we have something to say, we don't want people to look at us. If we have something to say, we want to say it. People can react to it, but we don't want it to be a case of, hey, I said something, look at me. What do you think about what I said? We want people to think about what we said. I don't own the idea. I think the earth is flat. You say that. I don't want people to then judge me or look at me. I want people to engage with the idea, even if that was a pretty stupid one. And so we have this difficulty because we don't address people, is the point I was making. And so what I told him, which obviously, when you give advice to people, you're usually talking to yourself at the same time. I'm a human, I'm not perfect, neither is the person I'm addressing. So anytime I give someone advice, it's, especially when I get more passionate about the advice, really I'm talking to myself at the same time. If I tell my brother, oh, you should stop hesitating, you should do that thing that you're scared to do. I'm not saying, hey, I'm God, I know everything about everything. That's not a problem I have, but I think you should do that, but I know you should do that. That's not what's happening. What's happening is I'm talking to myself at the same time, which is interesting once again when I talk to my brother, because we're so similar. This idea becomes even more three-dimensional in my head, that I am talking to myself currently. So once again, I have no idea what I was talking about. The thing I told him is, you need to address people when you're talking. One day, I hope I'll be in a position where I will address a crowd, which seems scary, right? But once again, I'm practicing for a reason. And every public speaker will say, when you're addressing a crowd, you are actually speaking to individual people. You have to look to specific people and address them. You can't just address a crowd, that's impossible. And so that skill is something that introverted people need to learn, that when you are in a social context, whether it be with a lot of people or even one or two, you need to be able to speak to those persons and to, in a weird way, maybe be selfish, as in, I have something to say, I'm going to tell you this, it's coming from me to you, instead of doing the thing that happens when no one hears your joke and you say, I'm just going to throw this joke out there. It's not for me, it's not about me. I don't want you to think, oh, I'm funny. I'm just going to throw the joke out there because I thought about it. Because what happens in those cases is that no one hears it. So that was the conversation we had. And I thought once again that it was really useful to me. Even when I was replying to him as if I was giving him advice and thinking, oh, I think it's this way, I think you should address people. What I was thinking in my head was, oh, I think I should address people. I should stop this thing of, hey, I'm humble. It's not about me. I'm just going to throw this out there. Because you have to be selfish in life in general. It's a weird thing to learn, but if you want to have a positive impact on the world, selfishness is required. You can't do everything through selflessness. And a lot of that is also lying to oneself. When you talk about introverts and they say Things like, yeah, I don't want people to look at me. I don't want them to think it's all about me. A lot of the time is because it is all about them, but they don't want to admit it. But yeah, I thought that was an interesting idea. Address people. Look in their eyes and let them know that you are addressing them. A lot of introverts, they won't look in your eyes. That's something I have noticed, and we've all noticed, I'm sure. People who are introverted and shy, they can't look into people's eyes, they can't do this, they can't do that. There's all these barriers. And breaking down these barriers, which, for example, I have no trouble looking into people's eyes when I talk, and when I talk to a single person, it's quite easy. But when there's more people, that's when it becomes more difficult. And when I close myself off, and I'm no longer addressing them, I'm just speaking, kind of speaking to myself, really. And so I suppose it all comes down to this one factor of, when I'm having a conversation with my brother, I'm talking to him and I'm listening to him, and I'm not thinking about anything else, really. I'm not thinking about how he's going to perceive me or anything like that. If I can apply that to any situation, specifically situations that are more challenging, if there's more people, in different scenarios, if I can do just the same thing of addressing the people I'm addressing, of not, getting in my head too much and questioning things too much, that's when you're able to connect with people. Because one thing that he said, I think I remember, was, what if I don't want to change? What if I don't care about being more successful in social situations? What if that's just the way I am, and I'm kind of happy being that way? And what I said to him was, we are having a conversation right now, you and me, and we're not struggling to talk. There's no difficulty. Yeah, I think the specific thing I said was, when I'm having a conversation with strangers, it feels like I have no idea what I'm doing. It feels like I'm playing a sport I've never played before. I don't know the rules. I don't know what to do, what not to do. That's how it feels having a conversation with a stranger. I have a lot of difficulty kind of advancing the conversation, keeping it going. And so I talked about how people at my work, for example, are masters at this. And even if the conversation is not necessarily intellectually challenging and interesting, they have that skill of keeping it going. And naturally his response, which was also my response initially, is, yeah, but I don't want to have useless conversations. I don't care about that. And so he said the thing that I used to think, and I replied, right now, you and I are having a conversation. It's a good one. We're not struggling in any way to speak our minds. We have lots of things to say. It doesn't feel like playing a new sport that you don't know the rules to. So how do we apply that to the real world now? And it all comes down to, he's my brother. I know almost everything about him and vice versa. So we can address each other truly. I can really talk to him. I see him, I know him, and I can really talk to him. There's no struggle there. But with strangers, we get this idea that this is a stranger. It sounds stupid, but this is not really a stranger. You know that person in many ways. That person is extremely similar to you. Any stranger in the world, they will have to sleep, they will have to shit, they will have to eat. They will have the same problems as you for the most part, some more extreme, some less extreme. But we all share the same problems to a degree. Existential dread, the weird questions we ask ourselves, how we feel about maybe the government, things like that. Most people, any person you'll meet ever in your lifetime, has a million things in common with you. So the whole concept of seeing people as strangers doesn't really make sense. What you're doing is you're projecting this stranger character onto that person, and immediately they become unapproachable. Immediately you think, I don't know everything about that person, therefore I should, stay back. I shouldn't approach. When really you should be thinking, oh, that person was born one day, that person had parents, that person has probably been to the doctor, that person has so many experiences in common with yourself. This just occurred to me now, by the way. Just making shit up. Anything else? I think that's good for today. I think that's good. Well, thank you. Enjoy the present. And I'm gonna quit this pretty soon. So expect no vape. Oh, it's episode 51, isn't it? That means in 1 week it will be 1 year since I started this. I mentioned a lot the idea that I feel like I've hit a plateau a long time ago now. Because when I started doing this, I was so bad at it and so uncomfortable that I quickly improved at the start. I improved exponentially at the start. And as a result, I quickly hit a plateau and stopped evolving. But in a way, reaching 1 year and being able to compare where I am 1 year from the first episode, there's no doubt that there will be, an immense difference between the first episode and the 1 year later episode. So I suppose a simple change of perspective, instead of thinking, oh, it's been weeks, months since I haven't truly evolved at that thing, I'm going to look at episode 1 and episode 52, and I'm going to think, wow, big difference. Just recalibrating yourself. Simple as. All right, thank you. Enjoy the present. It sounds like I said enjoy the president. You can do that too, but enjoy the present. Thank you.